love that story. Are there any questions?
This is on. Thank you both for sharing those stories. I can't stop crying. It seems to me a really big thing to change someone's notion of the wholeness of their body when they die. And I'm hearing for you, even with your loved ones, that that's a big barrier. Do you have any advice for healthcare providers on how we might initiate discussions with patients and who we can involve to help?
I think within the Aboriginal community, I went to speak in just outside of Chilliwack, in the Chehalis community, and that was one of the biggest questions that they had, and how they can engage their elders on the decisions that the family is making. And a man up there, not too much older than I am, was in need of a kidney, and the community was scared. And through Catherine Turner at the Kidney Foundation, she had brought me up there to talk about that and let them know, because they are quite close to the community where I am from, and we share the same beliefs. And it's engaging them also, letting them know that the risk factors are very, they're low. And I myself, I went there and I talked about it, and I was back at school 6 weeks after our transplant, and my daughter was back at school, and we had no complications. So I think just the awareness and education.
It also seems that the religious leaders should be included. Do you not? I'm just saying, it seems to me that you would, especially with the Asian culture and the equivalent within the Aboriginal culture, you'd want to engage the religious leaders as well, because I think that whether or not they agree or not, to get them on board and to dispel that, that you're still going to get to heaven or whatever you believe. It's more of a spiritual thing. The body, share the body.
That's a good point, and that's where my dad came into play, because he was the biggest person I had to convince, and now he's our biggest supporter.
I'm not sure, is this on? Yeah. I want to actually thank both of the speakers, because I think your stories are really heartfelt and very meaningful to us. I wanted to ask both of you if there were stories within your cultures that would help us perhaps link to the patients that we speak to, that we can help to show some understanding or some insight into the cultures that you come from, that would allow us then to ask or to help our patients and our families sort of start this pathway towards accepting organ donation and the process of transplantation. And the reason I ask that is simply one of the things that had helped me to, say, address in the cultural world, address some of the processes of dying. I used to be very sensitive that Jewish patients will, through their faith, really believe we do anything to keep your body alive. But learning and understanding the stories that supported the fact that you never disrupt death helped me to link with the Jewish communities sometimes, not always, but at least show that I'd understood and taken some time to learn about the faith. But it helped me to help patients, families go through that dying process. So I could say, I think today we've started the dying process, and then I didn't have to be so aggressive and do things that seemed to be wrong medically. So if we understand a bit more about the cultures, or we know some of your stories that would help us to link in, I don't know, is there, the story of so-and-so who was doing such and such in this particular situation. There's always stories, I read a lot of these books, say, from the native culture, where you can have a story and there's a moral in there. Is there a moralistic story from both cultures that could help us address organ transplantation? Sorry for the long talk.
In it would be difficult for the First Nations community to have one story that you could share, because in BC alone, there's 203 different First Nations communities. So I know that the stories would vary and it would be different.
I'm just thinking, I know, fortunately, that living donors amongst couples, like Chinese couples, are increasing. I'm gonna really go out here and say something else, which is that in the Asian culture, there's still a bit of male masochism. There's a bit of preference for, how can I say this? In a situation where it's a husband and wife, and if it's the wife that has the kidney disease and is looking for a transplant, I think the chances are less for the husband to donate to the wife than for the wife to donate to the husband. And that's something that I would love to see changed, but that's really addressing a huge cultural way of thinking. And it goes back to what I was talking about, how Asian women, like as a child, are told you need to sacrifice for your family, you know, for your brothers, your sister, so having one story, yeah, I would agree with Adrian that it's pretty difficult to do that. But I think what I was trying to do in my talk was just sort of show some basic underlying cultural beliefs so that, you know, for example, if you're dealing with a patient, you're not going to, and the patient is waiting in a waiting room with 10 other people, you're not going to come out and say, you know, and talk to that person about that person's case in front of all these other people, which sometimes can happen, actually, right? I mean, I've been to clinics where it does sometimes happen that the professional person will come out to the waiting room and start talking to the patient, and there's all these other patients around. So I think just that extra sensitivity. And also, I guess another thing I want to say is the concept of saving face. I kept sort of belaboring that a little bit because, you know, that patient, you may ask that patient if that patient is all right, and that patient's going to tell you yes, but he's not all right, because it's that saving face. Like, I can't let her know that I'm not okay. So it's a difficult situation for you who are out there obviously working with, you know, Asian CKD, because you're, you know, am I asking you to read their minds? Not necessarily, but just to be sensitive and maybe dig a little bit deeper on a one-to-one basis to see if there really are concerns, I guess especially with social workers. So those are some things that I can volunteer.
Thanks, Mimi. We have a couple questions here. Adrian, you said there's 203 different bands in BC. So is the belief of keeping the self whole shared across First Nations in BC? Would there be any differences band to band?
I wouldn't be able to speak on anybody outside of the Coast Salish territory, as where I'm from Squamish and Stalo, and we are Coast Salish people. And even within these communities, we have a few differences of language and of stories. So even between the two, we share a little bit of differences between where my mother and father are from. So I wouldn't be able to tell you what people have thought anywhere else from BC.
One last question. Mimi, do you know the best way for an Asian family to understand that with organ donation a person is still really intact?
That's a really great question. I think that perhaps emphasizing more the good that would come out of organ donation. because you're dealing with not necessarily, I mean, especially if they're Buddhist, it's not just a cultural belief, it becomes a religious belief. And so, you know, I certainly take your point very well that connecting with religious leaders who can promote and stand behind organ donation would definitely be a big help. Within the families themselves, getting them to even discuss it can be difficult. With the traditional family, they don't even want to talk about death because they're so superstitious that by merely talking about death, they're going to cause death to happen. I mean, that is how far the superstition goes. So there are definitely a lot of barriers to break there. But I think that, again, especially with the younger generation, in a family where there's parents and grandparents and children, if the children are educated well and the children are brought on side, then perhaps they can be the ones that start the conversation with their mom and dad and say, hey, you know, think about this. You know, you can save 8 people's lives by signing up, you know, and just to have that discussion about the goodness of donating would be one of my suggestions.